Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. Today, our Executive Director, Chris Costa, is joined by Dr. Jung H. Pak, Deputy Assistant Secretary, Bureau of East Asian and Public Affairs, U.S. Department of State. As Deputy Assistant Secretary, Dr. Pak is responsible for overseeing relations with Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. She also serves as the Deputy Special Representative for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Prior to arriving at State, she was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she focused on Korean Peninsula issues, East Asia regional dynamics, and transnational threats related to proliferation, cybersecurity, and climate change. While at Brookings, she authored Becoming Kim Jong-un, which has been translated into multiple languages and draws from her deep knowledge and experience as an intelligence officer. Dr. Pak has held senior positions at the Central Intelligence Agency, receiving several awards for contributions to the President's Daily Brief and superior analytic accomplishments. In addition, she received awards for service to advance workplace development. As the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Korea at the National Intelligence Council, she led the intelligence community's production of strategic analysis. She received her PhD from Columbia University and studied in South Korea as a Fulbright scholar. After Chris and Dr. Pak discuss the issues that are attracting their attention, we'll turn to you for your questions. Please use the Q&A feature to write them in. We anticipate a lot, but we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we possibly can. All right, over to you, Chris.
All right, Amanda, as always, thanks for the great introduction. We're really excited to have Dr. Pak here today to talk about issues related to national security for the Korean Peninsula, and perfect segue, kicked off this Monday with a bit of maybe a mini crisis, at least as far as I saw, with some missiles that were fired into the Sea of Japan. North Korea, once again, provocatively fired some missiles, and that happened on Monday. Ironically, it happened while the Secretary of State was on the ground in South Korea, so we see some signaling. He was there participating in a democracy summit. I think since then he has been off to the Middle East. So that got my attention first thing Monday morning. The second story that got my attention really has to do with Dr. Pak, because she actually engaged with her colleagues and counterparts, in China to talk about some of the escalatory behavior by the North Koreans. So it would be great to get some insights in a few minutes from Dr. Pak on that particular trip, but that hit the Reuters wire. The next story that got my attention was a lengthy New York Times piece that talked about, rhetorically, is Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, is he really ready to attack this time? And some academics have done some excellent pieces, by the way, that have suggested that perhaps now is the time for to actually ramp up the possibility for an attack in South Korea. We don't want to be alarmist, but some academicians have published some articles about some of the malign behavior. Russia also, so transitioning a bit to Ukraine, Russia has additionally been firing North Korean missiles toward the Ukraine, another piece of escalation while the United States is focused on Israel and Gaza, and of course Ukraine. Now we see that North Korea provides missiles that Russia uses and kills Ukrainians on the ground in that war. Additionally, part of the timing, perhaps, of the recent missiles that were fired into the Japanese Sea may have very well been triggered by the fact that the United States General Camera, particularly, who led those exercises, an American general officer with his South Korean counterparts, just oversaw a series of military exercises which were bigger than the past few years, frankly, and perhaps again signaling, but General Camera went on record talking about the importance of deterrence and ensuring that partners in the region understand the United States is committed, along with other partners, to working with South Korea for providing security. And the last story that got my attention, and I am having problems, I must say, with my mic here, so I apologize for that in advance. But Travis King. So this audience knows that each month I like to talk about a wrongful detainee or a hostage situation. That said, an interesting case broke out not too long ago. You might remember an American service member, a soldier who was in a little bit of trouble with his chain of command, ended up crossing into North Korea. Now, historically, there have been American soldiers, a few in the 1960s, that crossed into North Korea and actually defected. In this case, King crossed the border, and shortly thereafter, he was returned back to the United States. Of course, we were all grateful he was in good health, but the other piece of this is he'll likely face some form of justice from his chain of command. But it was interesting from my vantage point that North Korea didn't exploit this situation at all, which they did in the past with political defectors. So all of these stories have really, really got my attention. I think it's should be a front and center discussion that we should have about North Korean malign activities. And lastly, I must say, and I told Dr. Pack this, that I just traveled to the West Coast and I read her book from cover to cover, and I really enjoyed it. I should say, let me hold that up for a second. Becoming Kim Jong-un. It is about the despotic leader, the North Korean dictator. It's an outstanding, readable, accessible narrative written in non-intelligence language, even though she's a career, formerly a career intelligence analyst, not analytical language. This is readable, and I felt as though it brought to life some of the headlines that I just characterized. So I will be really interested to understand denuclearization, the use of hypersonic rockets, and just security on the peninsula writ large. I mean, what does this mean? Some people are breathless in terms of the North Korean threat. Others are more focused on Ukraine and Israel. But this is a real threat because of the potential nuclear capability, and I haven't even mentioned intercontinental ballistic missiles. So all of that was covered in this particular book, so I highly recommend it, very readable. Now I get to do the fun part and kick it over to Dr. Pack.
Chris, thank you so much for the great introduction. Amanda, thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to join you for Spy Chat. And thank you for that lay down of all of the news items that have hit the press in recent days. When I started on this account at the State Department, as I'm currently the senior official on DPRK issues in charge of the U.S. government's policy on DPRK, I didn't realize how much time I would be spending on Russia and the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the State Department. What we've seen, as Chris mentioned at the top, is that we have seen thousands of containers go from North Korea to Russia to support Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. And that we've also seen in at least 10 occasions where Russia has used North Korean ballistic missiles on Ukrainian infrastructure, on Ukraine cities, and to kill Ukraine civilians, thereby exacerbating the food and energy security issues that are hitting around the world, not to mention the fact that the undermining of territorial integrity and sovereignty that Russia, a permanent UN Security Council member, is attempting to erode. And so what we've seen over the past several months is North Korea growing strategically aligned with Moscow. And the implications of that are pretty serious. Now we have multiple theaters. We have the Asia theater as well as the Europe theater overlapping in ways that I think none of us has really seen in the past several decades. North Korea gets a lot from this in terms of whatever the monetary sums that they may be getting from Moscow, but they're also getting economic and diplomatic support. And they're probably also looking for Russian help to advance other technologies and other weapon systems. So we have reason to believe that the DPRK is really looking for things like fighter aircraft, surface-to-air missiles, other sensitive technology, ballistic missile, advanced technologies, and other items of concern. And what we've seen is this metastasis, and I think that was the last chapter of the book when I wrote it back in 2020, is the metastasis of the DPRK problem, and we're really seeing it in real life, in real terms, unfolding in the Ukraine theater and in the European theater. So what are we doing about it? At the State Department, as lead for the U.S. government's policy on DPRK policy, we are very focused on our allies and partners. We are working very closely trilaterally and bilaterally with the Republic of Korea, as well as Japan. And we're rallying the international community to make sure that we strengthen the sanctions regime and that we use all measures and all tools at our disposal, including export controls, as well as cyber efforts to make sure that the DPRK, that we choke revenue generation streams, that we do everything that we can with our allies and partners to make sure that Russia has a strategic failure in Ukraine, and also to make sure that the DPRK threat is reduced. We're also focused on extended deterrence and strengthening all ways that we can strengthen deterrence against potential DPRK actions. We have bolstered our military exercises. We have expanded our strategic dialogues with the Republic of Korea, as well as working trilaterally with Japan as well. And you know, as I mentioned, the theme here is allies and partners, and the administration, the Biden administration, has been extremely focused on allies and partners, and we're extremely confident and proud of the work that we've done in generating the chorus of international condemnation against the DPRK threat. That said, Chris, and for your audience, we are absolutely committed to diplomacy with the DPRK. This is an issue and a problem that can only be solved through diplomacy and dialogue, and we have done outreach publicly, privately, through third parties to make sure that the DPRK knows that we want dialogue without any preconditions at any level and at any time. And so we're working very hard on this issue set. We have not veered from our commitment to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And so, you know, really look forward to the audience's questions and to this dialogue here today. And let me turn it back to Amanda and Chris.
Thank you. That was a great opening talk. Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and kick off, Amanda, with questions. I'm sure we have some. I have a few if we don't have a lot of questions, but we usually do. Over to you, Amanda.
We have some very, very interesting questions, as you would imagine. One concerns, there was an intriguing opinion post in the New York Times over the weekend suggesting that China presents an opportunity for us because the tension actually between China and North Korea that Kim Jong-un has sought to kind of embarrass China in some ways, and that maybe there's an opening for us, for the West with that. Any comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for that great question. We have engaged with our Chinese interlocutors from the president on downward, and I did so recently with my counterpart in Beijing through a virtual meeting, that, as you've heard the President and our Secretary of State say, we want to work with China when it's in our interest, and DPRK has always been one of those measures because we have cooperated on the DPRK issue in the past. But I think what we've seen over the past several years is that the DPRK has been trying to get closer to Beijing. Now, trade between China and the DPRK is over 90%. So DPRK's trade is over 90% is dependent on its trade with China. So there is a great economic dependency there. But I think what we've seen is that we certainly think that Beijing could do more on sanctions implementation. And we continue to encourage our Chinese interlocutors to play a more positive, constructive role on Korean Peninsular issues. But what's really interesting about what the DPRK is doing in this current period of strategic competition between the U.S. and China, and this growing strategic alignment between China and Russia, is that the DPRK and Kim Jong-un himself has called this a new Cold War. So what does that do? Kim has been parroting PRC lines about China, about Taiwan, about Xinjiang, about Hong Kong. They've also, Kim Jong-un himself has welcomed Putin's visit to the DPRK. Kim's foreign minister went to Russia and met with Vladimir Putin. So what this new Cold War that Kim is calling it, it gives Kim this legitimacy that he's not this isolated rogue nation in Northeast Asia, but the provision of arms to Russia, inserting himself into this new paradigm, gives him a luster of legitimacy that he's not this cast aside, but that in aligning himself with Vladimir Putin and getting closer with Beijing, gives him that kind of boost or legitimacy that he had been looking for. So we will continue to press our Chinese interlocutors on sanctions implementation, on playing a positive role, on bringing Kim Jong-un to dialogue, and so we'll keep pressing on that. But but we also want to make sure that we strengthen our deterrence efforts with the Republic of Korea, as well as Japan, to make sure that we deter any or we try to deter any thoughts that Kim Jong-un might have to escalate tensions even further on the Korean Peninsula and beyond.
I don't have much to add to that, but I would just offer that it seems to me that really projects a sense of Kim Jong-un being really a rational actor given the situation that he's dealing with. So I walk away listening to you, reading your book, watching the headlines, and thinking he's very rational given the situation he might feel he's in. Could you comment off of that?
Absolutely rational, and that's something that I tease out in the book, and it's that we want to make sure that the public knows that he's not this 10-foot tall giant, but he's also not this irrational child figure, but that what he's doing, the actions that he's taken, are rational in his view. His goal is regime survival, and the means of regime survival and sustainment is through the nuclear weapons program. And it seems to me that he sees greater alignment with Russia as a way to ensure that regime survival and that goal.
Thank you. What else do we have, Amanda? That was a great question. As always, we get great questions.
Yeah. This one's very intriguing to me regarding the Russian focus. They suggest having signed a new bilateral agreement. The questioner asks, am I correct in thinking that is a strategic tactic due to the Five Eyes relationship that the United States is in with several key partners?
I think the way I hear that question is if there's some sort of signed agreement, is that to counter what the U.S. does with all of our allies and partners? I think there's a lot of truth in that, in trying to place and Kim and the DPRK trying to place itself in this anti-West, anti-US kind of bloc. We reject that, of course. The things that we do with our allies and partners is to make sure that we have a free and open, resilient Indo-Pacific as well as a global community. What the DPRK has been doing, and they've been doing a lot in terms of their weapons development, are banned by multiple UN Security Council resolutions that Moscow and Beijing have signed on to. So the missile tests that Chris has mentioned at the top, those are all banned by Security Council resolutions. They pose a threat to the Indo-Pacific, but they also pose a threat to globally, given that the DPRK continues to hone and advance these capabilities, including the intercontinental ballistic missile systems that they've tested multiple times at a lofted trajectory over the past couple of years.
I don't have a lot to add to that. That's pretty comprehensive. I would just argue that the importance of partners we've stressed multiple times today, and not only South Korea, but of course Japan. We've reiterated it. That partnership is key and critical to security, and we mentioned, of course, the Five Eyes that we talk about a lot here at Spy Chats.
I really appreciated what you said, Chris, about not being alarmist in raising some of the articles that have been written. We have seen, we don't see any evidence of near-term or military actions by the DPRK, but of course we are extremely concerned by how Kim might be emboldened by the stronger relationship with Russia. We have a permanent UN Security Council member that seems determined to shield DPRK for its actions that are universally and condemned by the international community. So of course we're very watchful for additional provocations, but I want to make sure that that the audience knows that I don't see any we don't see evidence of near-term military actions right now.
No, thanks for that, and I really appreciate that you stressed that, because again, the articles seemed a little alarmist, and of course that's what headlines do, right? But at the same time, as you dig in, this seems like a rational counterpoint to perceived threats from Kim Jong-un, and again, some of what you've written about and you've talked about in past documentaries really came to life as I thought through the problems that you're wrestling with. I'm glad you have to wrestle with these problems, by the way. What else do we have, Amanda?
You're
We're
so
on a roll
mean.
here.
You're so mean, Chris Costa. Dr. Pack, can you clarify a lofted trajectory?
Yes, thank you for that. So when you're testing an intercontinental ballistic missile, you don't want to do it at the regular trajectory because it will land somewhere. So when you do a lofted trajectory, it just goes straight up and then goes down into the water. Now, there are problems with this, of course, right, in terms of all of these ballistic missile tests. So in 2022, DPRK did 69 ballistic missile tests. Last year, they did several dozen. And all of these are in line with what Kim Jong-un has said that he was going to do. In January of 2021, he came out and said that he was going to develop a whole series of weapon systems, including hypersonic missiles, underwater attack vehicles, military reconnaissance satellites, solid fuel intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are very problematic for a variety of reasons. Solid fuel because they take less time or that's less time for warning, for example. So he's gone through this checklist of developments and he's been testing these new capabilities and he's been flaunting these new capabilities. And so we're very concerned about about his aspirations, about the follow through, and given the current strategic environment with Russia and the wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East, that somehow that he'll start to think that that no one's looking and no one's paying attention. But well, rest assured to your audience that we are all very much focused on this. I mentioned at the top that I didn't think that when I was going to do DPRK or working in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs that I'd be working on Russia so much. I think that's what's so fascinating about this current environment, the security environment, and Chris and the audience know so well that the security threats are real and the security threats have metastasized and the security theaters are overlapping in so many ways. And so, I'm really glad for the allies and partners that we have in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere, and we'll continue to watch this very closely and take every measures and use all the tools that we have to make sure that we deterred the DPRK.
It was a great question and a great explanation, so we can go ahead to the next question.
This questioner says, recent stories hint that North Korea isn't shipping as much ammo to Putin as earlier. Is this true? And if so, why? Also, does this hint at trouble with using ships to transfer? And how, this is a manifold question, and how exposed is the Russian rail line to sabotage? I don't know if you will speak to that last part, either of you, but Dr. Pak, you did say Russia's been a lot in your wheelhouse of late.
Yes, right. So we've seen thousands of containers leave DPRK for Russia, and we've seen Russia in at least 10 times use North Korean-made ballistic missiles to attack Ukraine. I don't have anything to share today on those reports, but given the increasing communications and visits and really fawning statements coming out of the DPRK for Russia and for President Putin, I don't think I think that relationship will continue to grow, at least in the near to medium term, because they both have an interest in continuing that relationship. I'll also mention that this is not just about the military relationship, but it's also economic, cultural. There have been lots of delegations and conversations between the DPRK and Russia on cultural exchanges, sports exchanges, economic issues. So this is a multi-dimensional relationship that we're looking at, and not just the military relationship.
Let me just dive in there on the idea, the possibility for sabotaging Russia. I'll just offer this again, not having access to classified. This is more a educated guess that the Ukrainians are very much assessing and looking at the possibility to be disruptive to any weapons that are being used against the Ukraine. And we know we've already seen a motivation, a willingness, and a series of operations that have taken place in Russia. And early on, there were different nations talking about red lines to include Russia. Attacking Mother Russia is a red line. That said, Ukraine has used special operations to cross the border. I think I have written several pieces on the importance of sabotage, the importance of subversion, unconventional warfare, regular warfare, all lumped together. But at the end of the day, subversion and sabotage are going to be a part of warfare. So Russia is equally vulnerable to disruption of their supply line. And I want to point out that Poland last summer, I was there on the ground talking to some of our Polish colleagues, former colleagues of mine, and they disrupted a cell of controlled by Russia that were disrupting and looking at disrupting rail coming into Poland, or I'm sorry, that were part of the logistic trail for weapons getting into Ukraine from Poland. So to put a finer point on it, the bottom line is Russia was exploring sabotage in a NATO country, and that was widely reported in the media. So this is going to happen. There are possibilities for miscalculations, and I think that's what nations have to assess.
There have been recent reports of Russia using chlorine gas in Ukraine. Do either of you see that that North Korea might take this as permission to potentially use chlorine gas?
Well, that would not be a good development. Look, I wrote in the book, and I laid it out in the book that DPRK does have a CBW program, and I think what we always want to be careful for, and this is a theme that runs through the book, and in my work now is that this is, Kim is still learning lessons, right? And is adapting, calibrating as he sees the changed environment or an unchanged environment. So, and as Chris has mentioned, he is a very rational actor, and I think we would always want to be very careful and very watchful for how Kim might take advantage of this current environment to do certain things that we would not want to see occur on the battle space, in the battlefield or elsewhere. I'll just remind everyone that the DPRK has used such weapons when in the assassination of Kim's brother, his older half-brother, in Malaysia in 2017. So this is and that was a very and I laid that out in the book about on the use of that. On that activity against the brother.
And I'll just add that the nuclear, chemical, biological, radiological threat on the ground in Ukraine is real. And the nuclear threat, we've heard Russia posturing, but at the end of the day, I also would like to make the point that Western intelligence services, be it Iran or North Korea, are going to do everything possible to identify opportunities to disrupt that flow of chemical weapons if in fact they are going to be proliferated and move into the battle space that Western forces, Ukraine particularly, are engaged in right now. So that's something that Western security services and intelligence services are going to monitor very, very closely. And I should say, parenthetically, I was at the White House when that attack took place in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and it was fascinating to see kind of the post-mortem, what was publicly available. And of course, your book did talk about that attack, and there have been some excellent documentaries that this audience can find online. And of course, you can come to the Spy Museum, where we talk about poison used by intelligence services like Bulgaria, Russia in the past, the Soviet Union, or currently even the FSB. So if you want a little nostalgia on assassinations, as troubling as it is, we tell those stories at the museum.
I have to mention that we do have some artifacts that will go on display hopefully later this year that are on loan to us from the Republic of Korea that come from North Korean spies that they have picked up. And one is I love it because it looks like a lipstick and it is a poison concealment. So those are going to be integrated into some interesting places in our collection, into our exhibitions very soon. Okay, back to work, Amanda. Stop talking about artifacts. We have so many great questions, but we were touching on family and how it is to be related to Kim Jong-un. It can be very dangerous. But what do you make of the increasingly heightened visibility of his daughter?
That is really interesting. And we saw the daughter, who is, I think, not yet a teenager, appear at ballistic missile launches, economic sites. So it's clear that that Kim Jong-un wants his daughter front and center. And I think there's probably a variety of reasons. And here I'm applying my analytic experience that there's probably a variety of reasons why he's doing that to perhaps show the younger generations or the sustainability of these weapon systems, about the regime, and also maybe to burnish her credentials. I think it's probably too soon to say whether she's it, because I think what we've seen in the past the past decade with Kim Jong-un, that he will always surprise us in terms of, and there's always room and flexibility for him to change his mind. But what's very clear is that he wants to have her front and center in these activities. I'll also note that what was also different about Kim versus his father and his grandfather is that he showcased his wife quite a bit. That his father and grandfather used to put their families in the background, so that they were front and center. That this is a cult of personality. But Kim Jong-un himself, he has made sure that his wife is with him on multiple occasions. She's very prominent, and the daughter appearing in the past couple of years. I think maybe he wants to be seen as this father figure for the nation. Maybe he wants to show the sustainability of the regime, and maybe to show that this is to provide a brighter future for the people of the DPRK. Now, just want to highlight too that the DPRK, 40% of their population is undernourished. 1 in 5 children are under the age of 5 are stunted. So Kim is clearly trying to put out an image out there that shows a very robust family society that has brighter future ahead.
I'm going to jump in with a follow-up. Could you talk about his sister as well? Because she's been elevated, it seems, at least from what I could tell.
Right, and the sister has always been prominent. You recall, Chris, when the summits with President Trump were occurring, she was scurrying back and forth and making sure that things were going well for her brother, handing him a pen or making sure he knows where to sit and where to go. She seemed to be handling those types of logistics for him. But we also saw in the past 3 or 4 years that she's coming out with statements of her own. Again, the family becomes elevated in terms of what her portfolio might be, and but the sister seems to have a clear special advisory role that she plays for her brother.
Thank you. What else, Amanda?
Yeah, well, I want to follow up on that because we're talking about women, and it's Women's History Month. What has the role? Have women had leadership positions in North Korea? What is it like to be a woman there, or a higher ranking woman?
Yeah, it's a patriarchal society, and with gender norms and rules. And there has not been a leader in the way that the 3 Kims men have been leaders. But women have played certain roles, usually of this motherly type, the mother of the revolutionary, and I think Kim is also using the woman's role in very different ways, but also sticking within the confines of historic norms. But we'll see. Maybe it's the daughter, but I think at this point it's very speculative on whether the next generation will be a woman leader.
Now, here's someone after my own heart. There you say, this may be simplistic, but what does Kim Jong-un hope to gain if he were to use nuclear weapons, given the inevitable retaliation?
Yeah, and this is, it's a great question. Kim Jong-un has been, I'd say, growing his nuclear portfolio over the past 10 years. He has promised to develop weapon systems that are very diversified. So you've seen ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons development. He's launching missiles from from a train, on the beach, on the side of the road. And so these are by submarine or submerged platforms. What does he hope to gain? I think he's developed, or the nuclear doctrine, I think, continues to evolve. I think a lot of it is legitimacy. A lot of it is regime survival. The fact that he can protect himself with these advanced nuclear weapons. He's surrounded by wealthier, larger, more militarily capable countries. So in developing that asymmetric military threat with nuclear weapons and diversifying those weapon systems, it gives him the asymmetric capabilities that he just does not have elsewhere. He doesn't have much of an economy. He doesn't have the conventional, the weapons and conventional warfare items are not on the scale that the Republic of Korea or his other neighbors would have, and so the nuclear weapons give him the boost, I think the luster of prestige of having these weapons, as well as the ability to use them if he feels attacked. So I think the nuclear doctrine continues to evolve, but of course, you don't want a country that's isolated with nuclear weapons, that has proliferated in the past and continues to do so. That is not a recipe for a stable, prosperous Northeast Asia or global community, for that matter.
And just put differently from your book, you made the point that his identity is very much inextricably linked to the idea of nuclear weapons. So the whole psychology behind the dictator is crucial. And I also want to make the point for our audience, because it's such a unique audience in terms of their interest level for intelligence in particular. Some of your book a lot of it refers to the psychology of intelligence analysis. So you went back to your foundational learning, at least in the US government, on the importance of the psychology of analysts, and as well as cognitive bias and all of the things that go along with that. So I very much appreciated that, and we do some of that in our galleries, as you well know, at the Spy Museum. So we focus on the psychology of analysis and cognitive bias and some of the traps that analysts fall into. But collectively, the world is trying to figure out this leader and what are his intentions. We know his capabilities, but we don't always know the leader's intentions. Similar with Putin.
Right, and I think, and I know you appreciate this, Chris, in that when working in the intel field, we're trained to not think from the U.S. perspective.
Right.
We think from the adversary's perspective, which I think really hones our empathy tradecraft in taking ourselves out of our own heads and thinking from the perspective of somebody else's heads, and thinking about how they might be calibrating, how they might be thinking about certain issues. And I think that helps to reduce the element of surprise or intel failure, to make sure that you're constantly thinking from the other side. And I think this is where diversity is important, that you want to have lots of different people thinking about this issue set, thinking from the adversary's perspective, to make sure that we have all sorts of bases covered.
Well, I love that. And for audience, once again, this idea of strategic empathy, I don't know who coined the phrase. I actually thought it was General McMaster, but I'm not certain. But he talked about it in the context of China and understanding our adversaries, moreover, understanding really the idea of competition and what drives some of the decision making. So I think that's such an important area to talk about today.
We had a question. I was going to move towards a little more towards the end because I always like to get hopeful at the end. But what you were just saying plays into this. One guest wanted to know, how can we improve the quality of life in North Korea? And they improve ours.
Thank you. We're continuing to reach out to the DPRK to see, with our unconditional offers of dialogue and diplomacy. During the pandemic, the DPRK was one of the first countries to just shut its borders in January of 2020. Since then, the humanitarian aid organizations, the diplomatic corps that had been based in Pyongyang had left. So we'll continue to press for humanitarian cooperation, for aid workers to be able to go back in. For our part, we will continue to quickly turn around and facilitate licenses or exemptions to make sure that aid could get in once the borders are open. But we really do want to make sure that the humanitarian aid gets into the country, regardless of where we are on the political situation or on the nuclear weapons situation or the denuclearization talks or lack thereof, because it's the right thing to do. And we want to make sure that we take care of the North Korean people as well.
Just to follow up, could you talk a little bit more about COVID in North Korea? Because I actually saw a segment this morning, I watched it, that you talked about how North Korea handled COVID. It started with one reported case, reportedly from a defector who redefected and had the virus. And it was an interesting and suspect storyline, to be clear. But it was a fascinating dynamic, and you talked a lot about that when it broke out.
Yeah, it's not clear to me exactly how they did what they did or the extent to which they were successful, because as I've mentioned, the borders have been closed. But looking at the country from the outside, they seem to have reasonably done okay. As I mentioned, they locked their borders as soon as the pandemic hit the headlines. They have, they've made sure to isolate people. I mean, and I think DPRK, the people are already pretty isolated, and they had used when you see the pictures, the people are wearing hazmat suits and spraying down surfaces, but I think it's really hard to tell. What I've seen from the outside, though, what we've seen from the outside is that even during the depths of the pandemic, you can see Kim overseeing some military maneuver or doing some meeting without a mask. And the people are around him are not wearing masks. So there's an element there of some confidence in that they had done the right thing, in that the DPRK thought that they had it under control. But also Beijing almost certainly provided some sorts of vaccines and other efforts to prophylactic measures to support the regime.
Thank you for that.
This one harkens back to your mentioning authoritarian states taking hostages, and the questioner mentions that North Korea was active decades ago in Zimbabwe and more recently in Mozambique. And they wondered, do you think that North Korea was acting alone or in coordination with Russia or China?
I'm not familiar with those issues.
I actually am not either, and I'm not being cagey. I'm not familiar with that, so I can't address it.
But I do. But the DPRK during the Cold War has engaged in abductions. This is something that we work on with the Japanese government. The abductees that were Japanese citizens who were kidnapped from Japan. And we fully support the Japanese government in trying to get a resolution of those abductees. And Korea as well also has abductees, POW families, divided families, and we support the Republic of Korea in trying to get those issues resolved as well. So North Korea is not a stranger to kidnappings or to activities like infiltrations and that sort over the past several decades. One item in which we did see was in 2010 with the attack on the South Korean warship, the Cheonan, as well as the shelling of the islands near the maritime border.
Having heard that, let me go back to that question. That was excellent. That was a great prompting. It occurred to me that those defectors from the United States Army in the 1960s that went to North Korea and became North Korean citizens eventually and served in their armed forces, the spouses that they ended up marrying were reportedly, at least in what I've read and from documentaries, they were reportedly kidnapped and brought to North Korea. But that was extremely, extremely sensitive from a DPRK standpoint. But one of the young service members was married to an individual that was kidnapped reportedly in Europe. Another one was kidnapped reportedly from Japan. So that might help provide a little color. That was a great question.
Yeah.
And that's great. And maybe since Chris and I have similar, or we're in that same ecosystem, let's not underestimate DPRK espionage efforts. And so, what we've been working on in the U.S. government is the malign cyber actors, and the DPRK has become increasingly sophisticated over the past few years, using cyber espionage to try to steal secrets, but also to try to steal intellectual property. And so we've been very focused on that, and we also assess that they're using cyber means more so now, especially during the pandemic when the attack surface has grown exponentially to fund their weapons programs. And so that's why we've been very focused on cyber along with our allies and partners, especially Korea.
In following on that explanation, Seoul has also intensified its crackdown on spy networks that are reportedly operating in South Korea. What am I talking about? The National Intelligence Service, along with police organizations on the ground, have essentially conducted a raid of a militant labor federation in South Korea. Some of the employees or actors or members were having contact in Cambodia, in other places in the region with North Korean agents. So it's interesting. I also read some accounts that there are as many as 50,000 North Korean agents. Again, nobody can substantiate that or can validate that. That also sounds a little overblown. But again, this is some of the open source reporting that I've seen on spy rings. It's a real concern when you look at the proximity, when you look at the geography, when you consider the culture of the North. So it's something that has to be taken serious, this idea of subversion.
What was the impact of President Trump's visit to North Korea?
I think it's too soon to say. In that I think it was the Trump administration tried to generate diplomacy and sustain that diplomacy. I think that because there was no outcome that was favorable to the DPRK, that it's possible that Kim has been does not think highly of diplomacy. But I think it's all an assessment versus fact. And of course, we've had the pandemic, which clouds what might have been, right? If not for the pandemic, would their borders still be open? It's a counterfactual that I think would be would get us down a rabbit hole. But the fact is, they've been shut down for 4 years now, and we've seen reports of some European delegations being able to go in, and there's some movement, definitely between North Korea and China and North Korea and Russia. But we hope that they'll open up their borders further, and so that we can get diplomacy back on track.
Okay, this was the first question that came in. It is the kind of question that's very dear to my heart, and I think we can squish it in as our last question. And that is a lovely person who says, as always, I'm looking for where the hope is, where the reassurance is for resolution. Any hope?
Always hope, right? Diplomacy is the art of what's possible, and I think as a leader, and I'm sure Chris, as an excellent leader in his field, you always have to be optimistic when you're a leader. Otherwise, why would people work for you? And I think that you always have to have hope that what you're doing matters. The arc of diplomacy, I think, is really long, and that it might not be for 5 years, 10 years, or decades. For example, the trilateral cooperation that we have with Korea and Japan, having the Camp David summit back in August, that was decades in the making, and I think that we always have hope, and we always will keep trying to reach for our goals there.
Yeah, and I'm very optimistic. First of all, we have Dr. Pak at State Department, a Deputy Assistant Secretary, that talked about during this program the importance of dialogue and the importance of diplomacy, and that's the desired end state, to have some kind of diplomatic breakthrough. So from my optic and from my sensing, despite the fact that there were missile tests on Monday, which look a lot to me like more signaling, suggests that there's plenty of room for strategic dialogue. The idea that we were talking today about strategic empathy, those are really, really important ideas. And I am super grateful that we had Dr. Pak here today to really illuminate this issue that I don't know that much about. So I am super grateful. Any more questions, or is that almost a wrap, Amanda?
That is a wrap, unless either of you want to say anything in closing. I will wrap us up. And trust me, there are a lot more questions. We just ran out of time.
No, I want to defer to Dr. Pak for the final word on today's program, but with my deep gratitude for your support to this program.
Yeah, well, Chris, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really important to reach out to audiences. The bulk of my work is with foreign interlocutors, but I really do want to make sure that I work and are responsive to American citizens, and that I explain what our policies are, and to take your questions and to answer them in the best way that I can. So really, thank you for the opportunity. This is a great conversation, great program, and thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pak, and thank you, Chris. This was really, really informative and wide-ranging, and we will be posting this program on our YouTube channel in the future if you'd like to watch it again or share it with any of your friends or colleagues. And as always, we have a wide variety of virtual and in-person programs, and hopefully soon we'll even have hybrid programs coming out of the museum. So please look at our calendar on our website to see what's happening, and we'd love to see you at an event in the future. Everyone, take care. Thank you so much.